I'll be open and honest here, it was an absolute nightmare of a job, fitting front suspension to a Mark II Leon. So in this video I'm going to show you the process, including all the bad bits, all the good bits. Oh yeah, there was no good bits. And then you can make up your mind whether you want to do it yourself or pop the car off the garage and get them to do it instead. Hey, I'm Kev, this is North Coast Workshop. You'll find content on car modification and DIY. In today's video, yes, the car has finally got its suspension kit fitted, the B12 Suspension Kit, consisting of eBack springs and Bilstein shock absorbers. And I'll just tell you now what a job it is changing the suspension on this car, well, for the front anyway. So in this video, I'm going to cover the front suspension setup and how I changed it over, and in a second video, which I hope to release fairly soon after this one, I'll be covering the rear suspension changeover as well. And of course, I'll be covering all the issues I ran into along the way, and these might be similar issues you run into yourself. So at the very end then, we're going to see what the B12 Suspension Kit has done to my Cupra R in terms of dropping it in ride height from standard to a new lowered setup. Now, I did do a short video prior to this video which showed my attempt at preparing the car as best I could before I fitted the suspension kit to it. So I'll leave a link for that up in the top corner of the screen just now for you if you want to go and watch that first and then come back to this video afterwards. And of course, throughout this video, if you see anything that you would do differently, or if you've got any tips or advice or any questions at all, then please drop it down below in the comments. This is my first time doing the suspension kit myself, so I'm not saying I'm any expert at it afterwards. I definitely kind of learned as I went along as I was doing it, so I do appreciate any comments or help down below in the comment section. That will help me and also other people that are watching this video as well. And just one more thing as well, just before we get started in the video, I've got some really important points for the suspension kit. So first of all, I highly recommend that you buy replacement bags of bolts and nuts for all four corners of the car, because there's a good chance not every single nut and bolt that comes off the car is going to come off in one piece, and a lot of these nuts and bolts are actually single use, they're stretch bolts, so it's recommended that you put brand new ones back in place for safety. I would as well get under the car before you install the suspension to check all the rest of the components on the suspension that's on the car to see if anything else needs replacing at the same time, so any ball joints or track rod ends or drop links. If you can have them ordered up at the same time, it means it's a lot less bother to take the car apart again at a later date to replace those parts. And talking of drop links, I would recommend that you order up a front pair of drop links for the car. They're fairly cheap and there's not much chance that the original ones will come off the car if they've been on for a good few years, because they tend to seize up and the only way to get them off is to cut them off. It's also worthwhile ordering up new strut top mount bearings as well and having them replaced at the same time when you have the shock absorbers off. This just save a job for having to do it later on, and also means that if it's original bearings that was on your car, maybe 5-10 years old, you'll definitely feel a difference in the steering weight. It will feel a lot lighter having these new bearings in place. And finally, of course, with taking out all these bolts and upsetting the suspension setup and putting it all back together again, have the car booked in for four-wheel alignment, because this will make sure the car is set up correctly, it's not going to pull left or right, and it's not going to cause any excessive wear on the tyres. So let's get into the video now, where we're getting this kit onto the Leon. So I'm looking after the garage at my place, but I had to park the car to one side because it's not that wide, and do one front wheel, one back wheel at the same time, and then move the car across the other side of the garage and do the same on the other side. If I had the space though, preferably I would jack the car up the front completely and have both front wheels off the ground and do them at the same time. So first up, what you want to do is pop the bonnet, take off the rubber strip along the bottom of the windscreen, and then take out the two short screws, one either side, and then remove this metal divider piece at the back of the engine bay. This now gives you access to the top of the suspension struts. Now there's a bunch of new tools I bought especially for this job, and I will list them throughout the video and also leave a list down in the description below with links to where you can find them. So first, grab yourself a 13mm ratchet spanner and loosen the top 3 bolts on the suspension strut. Have all these bolts loose, but don't take them out completely. Now, if the bottom captive nut is spinning underneath the strut, then you may need a specialist tool to hold the captive nut in place while you loosen the bolts at the top. Next up, I'm removing the center cap from the wheel. This is when the car is still sat down on the ground, and then I'm going to slacken off all the wheel bolts, not take them out, but just slacken them, and then also slacken off the drive shaft bolt. Now I did buy a specialist socket kit to take out drive shaft bolts, but for some reason one of the drive shaft bolts was actually just a standard bolt and not a drive shaft one at all, so I will be getting this replaced at the very end of the video, putting a new drive shaft bolt back in its place. Jack the car up and secure it firmly on axle stands. Now remove the wheel completely and make a start at the top of the drop link. Now what you've got to do is use an Allen key in the centre to hold it in place while you remove the nut on the outside. And what happens usually is once they corrode, they find that the centre of the head will round off around the Allen key and you can't turn it anymore. So this usually results in having to get a grinder out. Running the grinder over the head of the bolt will just make sure that it splits the nut completely. You can then chip the nut off around the edges and hammer through the drop link. Now I'm looking to remove the bracket that holds on the ABS wiring and also the brake line, but this 10mm bolt at the end tends to round as well, gets rusted, corroded and seized, so as you'll see it doesn't come out just now. So moving on to then taking the strut out of the hub itself. So get the wire brush, take as much corrosion off as possible and then just pile in WD-40. Angle it towards you so you can see the end of the nut. And then with your socket, and I've got an impact gun here, just take off this nut. Now again, I bought another specialist toolkit for the other side. You shouldn't really have to spin this bolt at all, it should just be able to get knocked out, but it was actually seized in the clamp section of the hub. I did put a long bar on the end of it, tried to move it so that it might set it free. But yeah, sadly it snapped off. This is a big problem, which I will be getting addressed very shortly. So after that, they resorted to trying to hammer this part out. It was severely seized in the hub, it would not move at all, no matter how long I hammered it for. I then used the hub separator to try and prise it open and separate it so that the bolt might come out, but again it didn't shift. So once this happened, what I had to do was cut a slot into the bolt that was holding on the brake line to remove it, and then I cut slots into the 3 Torx screws that were holding on the backing plate after I removed the brake disc. Then I removed the 3 nuts from the bottom of the ball joint, and I removed the drive shaft bolt out completely. And if you find the drive shaft won't come out, what you can do is thread in the drive shaft bolt back in a little bit, and then just tap it gently to try and knock free the drive shaft. So pulling down the suspension arm, this takes the ball joint out of play, and it also then releases the drive shaft at the same time. I just secured the drive shaft onto the end of the anti-roll bar just to make sure it didn't move anywhere. And finally just remove the track rod end from the hub. This was fairly straightforward, but it was stuck in place, so I just screwed the nut back on so it was sitting flush with the end of the track rod end bolt, and then gave it a tap a few times to release the track rod end completely. Then with the tool holding apart the hub at the back still in place, I then just continually hammered on the top of the hub to try and release it from the strut. Now bear in mind, if this bolt is still in place in the hub, when you try and remove the shock absorber from it, you'll be having resistance the whole time because there's a locator pin down the back of the suspension strut that'll be trying to get past the bolt that's in the hub. So this was what was causing an issue for me, both times on both sides actually. So just be wary that this is going to be a lot of hammering because you're trying to hammer this part of metal that's on the strut past the end of the bolt. It will go past, it will just break off and shear off, but it will make it a lot harder to get it off.
A few moments later.
It did take ages, it was a lot of hammering, and just watch your fingers, watch your wheel arches, just be careful, but it's the only way I could get it off. And once the hub finally came off, you can see the damage now of the broken bolt stuck in it. So I'll put this off to a place nearby, hopefully they'll be able to get it out for me. In the meantime, what I'm going to do is clean up the threads on the end of the drive shaft, and then just cover it in a rag with a cable tie to make sure it doesn't get dirty or damaged while it's waiting for the parts to get put back together. Now I'm going to remove the 3 bolts at the top of the strut to completely take the strut out of play. So now I'll show you 2 methods for taking the springs apart from the struts. Now the first way I'm going to show is with spring compressors. These were actually a really good pair of spring compressors I got online. Again, I'll leave links down below in the description. And they seem to stay in place and seem to hold a really good grip on the spring. Usually it's going to be quite a scary job to do, so please still do take care. And the method is to make sure you just adjust them, so tighten them slowly, just do a little bit each side at a time. Once you feel the tension has released from the strut top, then you can start to take away the nut from the strut top itself. Again, you can hold the inside with an Allen key to stop from spinning, and then use a specialist tool to use with a spanner at the same time to release the nut from the top of the strut. It's important to note that if you're wanting to reuse this strut, then please try not to let the inside spin, so making sure that Allen key is holding it in place and you're taking off the nut and not moving the strut around in the centre. Once the strut top is released, you want to take out the plastic cover. I just gave my cover a quick clean, and you should get new bump stops in with your new suspension springs. And you can see the old strut top here, it was very rusty, making a lot of noise when I twisted it compared to the brand new one. So new one's going back on. Popping the new spring in place, making sure it's located properly at the bottom of the strut, and then just transferring across the bump stop to the new strut top bearing, and then also the plastic boot cover. Now I did just try to push this down by hand to see if I get the nut on without having to compress the spring at all. I came so close, I tried for ages, but at the end I just had to give in and compress with the spring compressors, just compress the spring slightly to make sure that the strut top fell over top of the strut properly and I can get the nut back on by hand. Now I'm tightening up without holding the inside of the strut, but I'm watching it very carefully to make sure it wasn't moving. But as I started to get tighter with the nut at the end, it was about to start moving, so I held it in place again with the Allen key. And I'm using a marker pen here, a kind of paint marker pen, just to mark up the threads to make sure that if I check at a later date, I can see if it started to slacken or not. Now the second method, I managed to get a shot of this very handy floor stand spring compressor. Really useful bit of kit, a lot safer, a lot more stable compressing the springs. This method, it's the same way to take the nut off at the top, of course, but you've just got the security this thing is properly holding the strut and the spring in place, and it's securely squeezing it down and compressing it. You just use a foot pump on the side to obviously apply the pressure, and then there's another foot pedal on the side to release the pressure as well. Again, compressing the brand new spring in the spring compressor just to give enough space to put the nut on the top, popping on my strut top, the boot, and also they're bringing up the strut from the bottom and securing the nut on the top. And then tighten up and torque to the specs on the screen just now. So I was still waiting to get the hub back, so I decided to clean up the top of the strut area where it mounts up to the underside of the arch. So I removed a lot of rust that was there. I was actually wanting to try out this spray that I found, which meant it would be a rust reactor and stop any future rust from appearing. Then once I'd done that, I cleaned up the backs of the brake caliper, which I'd removed to get the hub off. And I cleaned up the end of the anti-roll bar as well, where surprisingly the drop link came off this end, pretty straightforward, but it's the same method as the top, an Allen key in the centre and then a spanner to take off the outside nut. Then cleaning up the mounting points for the ball joint, just top and bottom, and then using some copper grease as well. And then 2 days later, I picked up the hub back from the agricultural place, and yes, they managed to get the bolt out successfully. In that time, I'd already ordered a new backing plate and some replacement nuts to hold it in place. Now what you'll see here is a kind of locator pin down the back of the strut, and this goes down the gap in the hub. But this needs to be in line with the top of the bearing, and you'll see these 2 arrows going to the front of the car and the back of the car. So these sit in line front to back, and then you need to locate the pin down the back of the hub, so that's the way it's orientated. Again, having 2 people here is handy. You can have someone hold the strut up and push it up from the bottom, while someone uses the bolts at the top and pops them through. I'm giving the strut and the hub a good spraying with WD-40 to try and lubricate them, and this hopefully makes the hub go back onto the strut a lot easier. And you can see the spreader tool is still in the back of the hub there, holding it apart as best as possible. Then it's a case of just gently hammering, watching your fingers as always, and just hammering it up as much as you can, and you're trying to make sure there's a clear path for the bolt to pass through the back locating hook. Then locate your drive shaft back in place, and also at the same time trying to locate the ball joint into the top of the suspension arm. Spin in your drive shaft bolt as far as you can by hand. There'll be some thread lock on it probably, so you won't get in that far, but just as long as you don't cross the threads as you're putting it in. Then pop your nuts onto the bottom of your ball joint. And a quick refreshment break, of course. And again, I'll put all the torque settings on the screen. I then cleaned up all the faces of the brake disc and the hub itself to make sure everything sat flush and flat back together. And then applied some copper grease as well to make sure nothing stuck. And obviously then put the brake caliper back in place. and a new bolt for the bracket that holds on the ABS wiring and the brake lines. Quickly cleaned the threads on the end of the tie rod end and popped it back in place and torqued up. Again, this is the same method as the drop links, where you've got to hold the inside of the bolt as you tighten up the nut. I forgot to say I had to disconnect the ABS wiring from the end of the hub there, as you can see, but it's back in place. Just make sure you connect that back up. And then finally I'm checking through this hole here to see if it's clear, but you can still see part of the strut hook is in place and it's going to block off where the bolt's meant to go, so I need to hammer this up a bit more of the way. The easiest way to do the last bit here is to jack the suspension arm up, so put pressure upwards against the strut and then again gently tap it and you should be able to get it located into place. Once the hole is clear, I then pop a brand new bolt and nut in place and tighten them up to the following torque. And again I'm using a paint marker pen just to mark the bolt and nut in case there's any sort of movement later on in the suspension. And now release the jack from the suspension, and again then just clean the front of the brake disc where the wheel mounts onto it to make sure it's clean and it's not going to cause any issues with wheel balancing. And of course give your brake disc a good clean as well. There's a good chance you've got grease and oil on the brake disc as you're working away on the suspension. Bit of copper grease for good luck, clean off any excess, and I'm just spraying at the top of the strut here where the captive nuts are. This is where you usually have issues with old nuts where they spin and you need that tool to fix them, but just covering them in copper grease hopefully means they'll last a bit longer. Then finally I'm looking for my drop link, brand new drop link to go on. It's got new nuts as well on it, new nylon locking nuts. So secure the bottom in place first. So again, making sure you're holding the inside with the Allen key and tightening the nut, and the same with the top. This is where ratchet spanners would be really useful, so if you have got a large ratchet spanner, it would save a lot of time, although the top of the strut you'll find it's kind of set into a wee recess, so maybe an offset ring spanner is kind of the only option. Now I'm just applying some copper grease on all the bolts and nuts just to try and stop corrosion from setting in too soon. I'm not saying this is going to last forever, it might not work at all, but it's just something I've started doing fairly recently. And then getting a wire brush just to clean up the end of the wheel bolts. Tighten them up as far as you can by hand, then with a socket and a ratchet. Drop the car down the suspension and then finally torque up your center driveshaft bolt. And then make sure you tighten and torque up your wheel bolts. And then go to your strut top and tighten down these 3 bolts. It's hard to see here, but if you can try and get your bolts to match up where the recess is into the paint. So you'll see marks where they sat before, and try and have these match up because this can affect camber of the wheels if you have them too far off. Then you just repeat this process for the other side, and once complete, you replace the metal backing panel, pop in the 2 torque screws either side, and then put the rubber strip back in place. So that is now new front shocks and springs fitted to the front of my Leon. I told you it's a job. But anyway, now to tackle the back of the car instead. So I put new springs and shocks in the back, and then at the very end check the difference from ride height from its standard ride height down to this new B12 suspension setup instead. So once that video is done, I'll pop it up here in the corner if you click on. Hit thumbs up button if you enjoyed the video and found it useful in any sort of way at all, and hit subscribe down below as well so you don't miss any future videos from this channel. Thanks for watching, goodbye.